Very good evening and a warm welcome to Personal Finance. I'm Gugulethu Cele. Now today I'm joined by Vuyani Jones, Head of Family Office at ABSA Wealth and Investment Management, to take a look at appropriate wealth generation strategies and wealth transference and how to make sure that these are in place and looking at the relevant alternatives. Good to have you with us this evening and thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me.
If we do take a look at wealth management strategies, it sounds like this huge word and something that is difficult to overcome, especially in the macroeconomic environment that we're struggling in at the moment. It's for a lot of investors, some of them say it's so difficult to find wealth. Is this the case? Has it been exacerbated by these macroeconomic conditions and market volatility that we so often refer to?
I think generally the markets have a huge influence in terms of people's balance sheets and returns. So of course, over shorter term periods, it does influence how people look at their wealth and how they perceive the success of that wealth. However, you'll find that in terms of looking at the wealth transfer and wealth management itself, in terms of preservation and growth, you have to look at it from a longer term perspective in terms of making sure that it's way beyond your life. So in times, yes, we do focus on the short term because it gives you an opportunity to take tactical opportunities, right? However, over the longer term, the strategy should remain the same if you're very clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Yeah.
Let's start exactly with that definition, wealth. What is the definition of someone who's wealthy before we can actually determine the best approach that they need to take when it comes to wealth management? So with me and 100 million rand in my kitty, is that sufficient?
Well, I think I found that wealth is a relative term. Obviously in the industries we've got different definitions. We use net asset values, we use the amount of investments you've got, but the reality is that wealth is about whether or not you feel wealthy, and it's relative from where you come from.
Yeah.
Right? When I talk about wealth management, I always highlight that I don't necessarily only just look at the component which everybody focuses on, the financial wealth. I look at three aspects. I think that wealth is, you look at the financial one, which is what the markets and your balance sheets typically are about. I look at also the individual or personal, which is around how are you preparing people and how are you helping people to maintain and keep their wealth or transfer it. And then I talk about the intellectual. So what knowledge are you imparting to ensure that actually you don't go for a situation where you go from rags to riches to rags, which is often a case in our industry. So it oscillates all the time. If I've got 500,000 rand, I could find myself very wealthy. And that's why I say that it's a relative. But in our industry, it is generally in the millions.
Exactly. So unless you're playing in that regard, then we need to approach it accordingly when it comes to the right strategy.
That's true. But, you know, I always find that the lessons are the same. Whether you've got a balance sheet which is 500,000 or you've got a balance sheet of 1 billion. You can learn certain strategies despite the quantum of the actual amount itself. And then personal and intellectual, you can't quantify it from a numbers perspective, can you?
Let's break that down further, because it sounds like two important elements when it does come to wealth creation and wealth transference. But from a personal perspective, what are the key considerations that you look at in ensuring that there's consistency with regard to wealth?
Well, from a personal perspective, remember that in the end, there's an individual. There's an individual who's creating the wealth. And on the other side, there's an individual eventually who is receiving the wealth, right? So from a personal perspective, it's around what lessons, what mentoring, what training do you give to people as they're building their wealth? And from a recipient perspective, what lessons do you give them? What strategies do you give them in order for them to be able to receive the wealth? And I'll give you a classic example. Generally, very wealthy people who've got lots of businesses tend to assume that their children have got the qualities to carry it forward.
Yeah.
Right? However, let's make an example of a father who's a very well-to-do business person, right? He's not always in meetings with his son or his daughter, and therefore they're not looking and seeing how they make decisions. So you have to create an avenue where a child can actually see how their parents make financial decisions around the business, particularly around the business decisions that they will take. So if you think of a great way to teach children is when you look at things like philanthropy. A lot of wealthy clients will want to give because they feel like they want to leave the world better. those decisions that they make, it's usually very good to let the children be part of that, because it's a less threatening environment, and therefore they can start exploring and seeing what goes into the decisions. Taking into considerations that you also have to be in board meetings and all sorts of things like that. Those are things that you should be training your child for way before they get that wealth, if you know that that's the situation that they're potentially going to be in.
Is there an appropriate age, though?
I don't think so. I mean, I'll tell you that my youngest child, whom I'm training right now, is 4 years old. I know.
To make board level decisions.
Not necessarily board level decisions. So we tailor the training based on the child, and also based on what the purpose of the wealth is for the parent or the creator of the wealth. So for instance, with this particular family, the father wanted us to start exposing the children to finance, to investments at an early age. So with these children, we have, I think everybody knows the marshmallow test, where you see whether or not they're going to be able to wait for a minute before they start benefiting. So we put them in a room and we see what they're going to do, and we say that we'll give them a mushroom the longer they, not a marshmallow, the longer they wait to get the longer they wait, the more rewarded the more the reward.
Yes.
And after that, then we start talking about shares. So a simple philosophy that I have with kids, for instance, that I ask them where they spend most of their money. And the general thumb, before you start getting into the technicalities and everything, is that I start asking them whether or not they own any of those shares or those companies that they spend a lot of money. So typically you find that my children that I train, I call them mine, because you develop a relationship with them. You'll find that, so the 4-year-old at the time when they started, for instance, said that she spends most of her money, she makes sure that her dad takes her to Spur.
Clever girl. Clearly she likes ribs. And then you encourage her to purchase shares in that
So we
company.
said, okay, how do you get access to buying, a restaurant where so we looked at famous brands, for instance. The older sister, she's around 14, she says that she said she liked, she uses most of her money on cell phones. So we said, okay, let's look at it. But it's little, and at that time it's not really about them making money, profits, and seeing the market, the value of the share going up, but it's about starting to get them to be engaged. And as the market or the share price goes down and up, then you start explaining what's happening. So they learn from a very, very young age. And another example would be that I generally tell the parents that for birthday presents or Christmas presents, give shares.
That's a good idea.
Because you give a doll, and within a few minutes, what happens?
Exactly. The novelty is worn off.
It's worn off. So give shares, and then also make sure that there's conditions to when they can liquidate these shares. So for instance, when you graduate from high school and are accepted into university, you can liquidate 20% of the shares.
Sure.
Things like that. And that's where you're starting to engage in terms of the personal, the human element of wealth, right? The intellectual element of wealth is where you start saying, what are the skills that these kids are supposed to be exposed to? So you start thinking around the schools that they should be in, who should they be interacting with, networks which are there. And that's around making sure that from a technical perspective, they'll be able to apply their mind to even complex issues and to get them to be very simple. Because it's very daunting. Imagine if you're a child and you're walking around Google, and before you know it, a phone call rings and you hear that you're worth 200 million.
Exactly.
Right? You're not ready for that.
No, because the first thing you're thinking is a fancy sports car, traveling the world, turning up is how they refer to it these days, with friends. And then, as you say, the wealth dissipates.
Yeah. And generally, I mean, around 85 to 90% of all wealth transfer fails. And that means within 10 years, the beneficiaries have lost control of that. And the ones who do manage to keep it, they say that you'll typically go through one generation where they'll create the wealth. The second generation will possibly maintain the wealth, right? The third generation, they've been provided with everything and they tend to just spend. And that's your typical, I don't want to say the word because then it almost has a negative connotation, but the trust fund children. You have to do a lot as well, because at the same time, when you do, as a parent, you're thinking, I'm giving my child this pot of wealth, or I'm leaving them with something.
A positive base on which to start off with, yeah.
But you have to be careful to not rob them of an opportunity for them to be able to create things themselves.
Just to close off with, before we get to our closing remarks on the show, are there particular trends that we see with families who have had wealth being created from generations back to families where it's new money? It's a trend, the typical rags to riches story that you referred to.
So typical trends that we've picked up is that I found that generally when it's generation one, the parents are generally very eager to get their children to start getting involved in their businesses, right? And I found that it becomes more successful if you can let a child prove themselves in other industries first and then bring them on. The reason is that sometimes you find that there's a bit of a bias. There's certain things which are overlooked when it's a child. It's either there's a bias, you're too soft, or they become too strict, right? So generally what you need is that you need to get a child to develop their own strategies everywhere. To get into finance, if it's a bank, if you're a founder of a bank, get them to get into banking or into financial services. And when they've proven their stripes, start bringing them into your own business, right? The second trend that I've found is that we generally, when it's new money, you want to give your child everything. You say, I had a difficult upbringing and I don't want my children to go through that, right? However, you're actually crippling that child. You're crippling them because you're robbing them of an opportunity to know what it feels like to get that first job on merit, to be able to save and to buy that first car on merit, right? I'm not saying you can't help. I'm just saying don't give.
So true. Well, just before we do wrap up our conversation on a powerful note, quite clearly, let's just get a brief recap of some of the key takeaways from tonight's discussion. Vuyani, you've certainly given us a lot of food for thought, but if we have to summarize it all tonight, what are the key considerations for the viewers watching at home in order to bear in mind, regardless of whether they have 500,000 or 500 million in their bank accounts?
I think a key consideration is that markets are volatile. Remember, that's one element of your wealth, that's looking at the finance. Markets are volatile. Have a long-term strategy and stick to it. I know it sounds like cliche, but that's the truth. The second element around it is that be sure that you've got a comprehensive strategy, or your advisor is giving you a comprehensive strategy or assistance in terms of how you train the next generation. And the third one is that make sure that your children are equipped and always exposed to how you make decisions so that they can follow through.
Fantastic. Vuyani, thank you so much for your time today. Certainly giving us some insightful views when it comes to ensuring that the wealth is not only created within a particular generation, but also transferred accordingly, and that it stays intact. But that's where we leave it for Personal Finance this evening. A big thank you once more to Vuyani Jones, who's the Head of Family Office at ABSA Wealth and Investment Management. Do remember that we want to hear from you, so send us your thoughts and insights to @CNBC Africa using the hashtag Finance410, or to myself at Gugulethu on Twitter. Until next time, have a wonderful evening.